and welcome everyone to this lecture. And I am very grateful to you for braving the hazards of Zoom to engage with me this evening. But I suppose given the inclement weather conditions that we're experiencing at the moment, you don't have any other distractions of long sunny evenings walking the beach at Glitter or Ballybunion to entertain you. So I'm hoping that this evening I will make an interesting presentation for you and that you won't regret tuning in to listen to me. Now, at the very outset, I want to make it very clear, I am not an expert on modern Anglo-Irish literature. I'm not an expert in literary criticism. I'm not into literary theory either. I'm an historian and a lawyer, and I'm looking at this purely in the historical perspective of the significance of Thomas Mccreavy. And in this regard, looking at Mccreavy, the Kerryman and the Cosmopolitan. And I'm going to divide this presentation into two parts. The major part is explaining his significance in the wider world, for Ireland and Europe, particularly the Cosmopolitan Mccreavy. And then we go back to what it was that enabled him to be a cosmopolitan, the formative and educational influences on him in Kerry. So there are two authoritative publications, which are both quite excellent if you're interested in reading further on Mccreavy. One is Thomas Mccreavy, an annotated edition by Susan Schreibman. And the other is a more recent publication by Cork University Press. It really is an excellent and most accessible and approachable book for the non-specialist, Thomas Mccreavy and the Rise of the Irish Avant-Garde, or the modern movement, if you like. So these two books are highly recommended to you if you want to read more on Thomas Mccreavy and order them through your good bookshops there. I'm sure Brenda Wolfe and Listowel will be very happy to arrange them for you. So Mccreavy, many of you are aware of his background, born in Tarbert in 1893 and educated locally, went into the British Civil Service, subsequently served in the intelligence division of the Admiralty in the early years of the First World War until he entered the Royal Artillery and served at Ypres Salient and Messines in 1917, 1918, where he was badly wounded, went on to Trinity College Dublin afterwards to do a degree, and then became very much involved in literary and artistic circles, becoming himself a noted poet and art critic and literary critic and translator, rising ultimately to become the director of the National Gallery of Ireland. But he is a key figure, as recognized by Samuel Beckett, among others, in the development of modernism as a movement in the arts and in literature, not just only in Europe, but in Ireland. And in particular, he's a key figure in giving a genuine cultural expression to the newly independent Ireland in the modern world. Between 1919 and 1924, Mccreavy resided in Dublin, took his honours degree in history and political science from Trinity College, and subsequently worked as assistant secretary to the Irish Advisory Committee of the Carnegie Trust. Now, the Carnegie Trust, as you know, is a benevolent organization that has sponsored educational initiatives, promotion of literacy, and indeed built libraries and staffed them and ran them around the world, including indeed in Listowel. And Mccreavy became active with the Dublin Arts Club and the Dublin Drama League, and alongside figures like Lennox Robinson and Christina Keogh, he co-founded the Irish Central Library for Students. Also, he wrote articles on art, literature, poetry, and drama in The Leader, The Irish Statesman, and The Gale. And like others in his circle, such as the visual artists Mainie Jellett, Evie Hone, Sarah Purser, Harry Clarke, Jack B. Yates, and literary figures such as W. B. Yates, Seamus O'Sullivan, Sean O'Faolain, and the aforementioned Lennox Robinson and Christina Keogh, Mccreavy opposed the increasing censorship, the creeping clericalism, and the insularist Irish Ireland ideology that was gaining influence over the Irish Free State. They regarded it as being inauthentic, spurious, superficial, and a betrayal of Ireland's ancient cultural heritage, which had not been insularist, but had been influential on Europe, as much as it was simultaneously informed by Europe. Indeed, in his address to the Irish Society at Oxford in 1934, Mccreavy noted the irony of how Ireland, after a decade of independence, had failed to create a basis for its own cultural self-expression, and the retreat into a puritanical insularism would leave Ireland no better than, as he said, a London Irish cultural province. He was scathing of the introduction of censorship into Ireland. And here is a portrait of Mccreavy from this time by Sarah Purser. It was painted around 1921, around the time of the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And Sarah, of course, was the first woman to be elected to the Royal Hibernian Academy in 1925. So these are key dates. It's a very important formative period in the formation of independent Ireland, the early years. And in 1924, Mccreavy paid a visit to Spain in that summer. Now, this is something that a number of the biographers of Mccreavy haven't really focused too much attention on. They tend more to focus on his time in Paris, because that's where he's connected with James Joyce and Samuel Beckett and others. But in Spain during this time, Mccreavy is in contact with a very important movement in Spain, led by the great Spanish poet Antonio Machado. And he was the leader of what was called the Generación de 98, or the generation of 98. Now, when we think of 98 here, we think of 1798 and all of that revolutionary fervor, etc., and its legacy for Irish nationalism and republicanism. But in Spain, we're not talking about republicanism here, but more so about asserting a new national confidence. And the background to this bears certain similarities to Mccreavy's experience of warfare and emerging from warfare. The American-Spanish War of 1898 had a profound psychological effect on Spanish society, and particularly on the younger generations in Spain at that time. Now, Spain was the USA's oldest ally, having recognized the American Declaration of Independence in 1776, supported that war of independence against Britain, and even allowed the fledgling USA to use Spanish currency to establish its financial and economic foundation. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the US dollar began its life as the Spanish dollar, or thaler, as it was originally called. And Spanish silver is what underpinned the fledgling United States finances. So Spanish currency established the American financial and economic foundation. Yet, without justification, the USA invaded and seized the Spanish overseas territories of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines in 1898. And Britain, which at that time was officially an ally of Spain, betrayed its alliance. So the loss of these remaining transatlantic possessions undermined Spanish national confidence and led to much social unrest. Now, in reaction to the introspective and isolationist retreat of the establishment, a younger generation emerged to find new ways of interpreting the past glories of Spain's national culture and heritage to provide inspiration for the future in a realistic rather than a romanticized or pietistic or obscurantist manner. Known as the Generation of 98, literary figures, artists, poets, historians, architects, lawyers, and political activists emerged under the mentorship of figures such as the philosopher and educator Miguel de Unamuno, who, I might add, was a great friend of the Irish College in Salamanca. Some of you might remember the late Father Michael Stack, the parish priest of Ballydonoghu. He was a native of Listowel Parish, of course, originally. He was one of the last of our Salamancan students. He was in Salamanca from about roughly 1932, 33 until 1936, but he remembered Unamuno coming to visit them in the college and to give them lectures and talk to them, etc., and remembered him fondly. He had been a student of Unamuno's. The other was Joaquin Sorolla, the great painter, who had an influence on the works of Jack B. Yates, and the poet Antonio Machado, whom I had mentioned earlier. And when Mccreavy met Machado in Madrid's Café Gijón, there on the Recoletos, on the Gran Via, the Avenida Castellana, in May 1924, he found mutual interest, understanding, and fellowship. So, between 1929 and 1936, Mccreavy published his translations of a selection of poems by the Spanish poets of the Generation of 98. And these translations were later augmented and published in 1945 and 1950. Now, there you have a list of the names and their dates. And also I've included Rafael Alberti, who was a young man at this stage who came to Mccreavy's notice, and Mccreavy gave him his first, shall we say, outing in the English language sphere. He's noted as belonging to the generation of 1927. But Mccreavy translated Alberti's Sobre los Ángeles, On the Angels, or About the Angels, 1929. Guillen's Cántico, 1928, Cántico, I Sing. Jiménez, his Elegias Lamentables, or tragic or sad elegies, or mournful elegies would be a better translation, 1908. And he also translated Jiménez's Diario de una poeta recién casado, 1917, which literally means the diary of a poet recently married. And Mccreavy, perhaps mischievously, being a confirmed bachelor himself, translated it as remorse. And of course, he also translated Piedra y Cielo, the stones and heaven, or earth and heaven. So Mccreavy's, shall we say, first major engagement with European literature and the arts is not in Paris, it's actually in Madrid, in Spain. And what I said about this generation of 98 and their objectives This is exactly what shined with Mccreavy and his contemporaries in Dublin, how they tried to create a new interpretation of Ireland's past and her culture and engage with realism instead of some obscure romantic notions that have their roots in 19th century nationalism rather than in the much more glorious earlier history of ancient and medieval Ireland. Mccreavy, then in France, he was appointed lecteur d'anglais, or lecturer of English, at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris in January of 1927, with a high recommendation from his good friend, the great writer T.S. Eliot. And there you see a photograph of James Joyce in Paris, taken about 1925. And Mccreavy, armed with a letter of introduction from his good friend W.B. Yates, met James Joyce and soon became his assistant with work in progress. And significantly, it was Mccreavy who was the first to publish a defense of Joyce's oeuvre entitled The Catholic Element in Work in Progress in Paris, 1929. And this was aimed as a broadside against certain people in Ireland who claimed that Joyce was scandalous and anti-Catholic, etc. The very fact that Joyce appointed Mccreavy to be the executor of his will testifies to the deep trust, confidence, and esteem that Joyce had for this Kerryman. Now, Mccreavy's Parisian milieu, just like his Madrid milieu, included very prominent figures in the artistic, cultural, and literary movements of the time, such as Paul Valéry, the French poet, philosopher, and essayist, whose work Introduction à la méthode de Leonardo da Vinci, Mccreavy would translate into English and publish in 1929. Sylvia Beach, the American-born publisher who lived most of her life in Paris and ran Shakespeare's bookshop there, she was the one who published Joyce's Ulysses in 1922. And I want you to keep that in mind because we'll be coming back to that and the Listowel connection later on. Eugène Zola, the literary critic, writer, and translator, and of course Samuel Beckett, who succeeded Mccreavy as lecteur d'anglais at the École Normale Supérieure when Mccreavy was appointed secretary of the English edition of the Francophone International Arts magazine Form, which has since moved from Paris to Montreal in Quebec in French-speaking Canada. Then Mccreavy returned to London in 1933, where he worked as a chief art critic for the Studio. And in May of 1934, his book on his own poetic compositions, Poems, was published by William Heinemann in London, and later that year reprinted by the Viking Press in New York. And in 1935, he was appointed permanent lecturer at the National Gallery until the outbreak of World War II in September 1939 interrupted that work. Mccreavy helped to evacuate paintings and other artworks to the countryside for safekeeping during the Blitz from September the 7th, 1940 to the 11th of May, 1941. And those of you from Tarbert who, like me, knew and were friendly with Mccreavy's sister, Delia, will remember being told in our childhoods stories about the Blitz in London and her time there with her brother. Delia was teaching in England at the time. Now, Mccreavy's other translations were works on art appreciation and literature. As I mentioned, Paul Valéry's Introduction to the Method of Leonardo da Vinci, Henri de Montholon, The Lament for the Death of the Upper Class, published in London 1935, and it was reprinted for an American readership under the title Perish in Their Pride, New York 1936. And I might add here that it was this version, Perish in Their Pride, that Mccreavy presented as little gifts to various friends of his in Tarbert. And shall we say, certain grand matrons of Tarbert society at that time weren't quite amused. They were wondering, was there a double meaning behind the title and being presented to them, especially when around that time it was often told there was a traveling salesman in Tarbert and he wasn't making any sales, and he was in the square, and someone approached him and asked him, had he any luck in Tarbert? And he said, no. He said, I'm afraid Tarbert is full of pride, poverty, and pianos. So, perish in their pride. Ella Maya, Her Forbidden Journey from Peking to Kashmir, published in London 1937, and again another work by Henri de Monthelon, Pity for Women, published in London 1937. So Mccreavy's own published writings from the interwar period 1919 to 39, other than his poems, present a very interesting insight into his intellectual range. For example, Pomona. Now, this served as the theme for a ballet in one act composed by Constant Lambert in London, and this was published in London and Oxford in 1928. We don't often associate Mccreavy with music and ballet, but there you are. Richard Aldington, an Englishman, and T.S. Eliot, a study. These were Mccreavy's own observations on these two men whom he was very close friends with and had worked with at an earlier period in England before he went to Paris. Then his own book of poems, published in London 1934, and then in 29 and again in 36, his defense of Joyce with the Catholic element in Work in Progress. And then his own writings from the post-World War II period. His first is that marvelous work, Jack B. Yates, An Appreciation and an Interpretation, Dublin 1945. Pictures in the Irish National Gallery, published in Cork by Mercier Press in 1945, reprinted in London in 46. And then Nicolas Poussin, this was a subject of the great French painter, Dublin 1960. And then Mccreavy's Some Italian Pictures in the National Gallery of Ireland of 1963. And following his death, there was a posthumous publication of his collected poems that were edited by Thomas Dillon Redshaw in Dublin, 1971. So that gives you a sense, ladies and gentlemen, of the milieu in which he mixed in London, in Paris, in Madrid, his movement in those modernist circles abroad, and his return to Dublin and his pragmatic promotion of modernism really takes off from 41 onwards. So on his return, he wrote for the Father Matthew Record and the Capuchin Annual. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with these publications, who've never seen them, I think you're going to be very surprised, because these are two Catholic publications that provided an outlet for informed thinking, critical Catholics, and promoted high culture, literary and artistic interests, and combined both the national and the international scenes, and went completely against the grain of Archbishop John Charles McQuaid's twisted and obscurantist interpretation of Catholicism. And in 1943, Mccreavy became a member of the editorial staff of the Capuchin Annual. And in November of 1941, he had already been appointed art critic for the Irish Times until his contract ended in December 1944. Now, that in itself should tell you that this image of De Valera and McQuaid's Ireland, the 30s and 40s being somewhat grim places, and in many ways it was, there was still cultural life, and there was still a milieu, and the flame of civilization was kept alive. And this is a very important feature that some cultural historians of modern Ireland miss out on completely because they don't know about it. They haven't done their research properly. So just keep that in mind. Now we come to this figure, who was a very important figure in Mccreavy's earlier period, Mamie Jellett. And she was described as the woman who brought modernist art to Ireland. And before Mccreavy died, he achieved a marvelous event in Dublin where there was a retrospective on the works of Mamie Jellett. And he was responsible for helping to organize that marvelous recognition, albeit posthumous, but nevertheless it was important to do so. And he would have known her very well when he was in Dublin in the period from 1919 until about 1925. So this is some of her work. And Mccreavy, in his various essays on modernism in Irish art, in the Capuchin Annual, for instance, and the Father Matthew Journal, other places, and internationally as well, he wrote about her works. And here you can see Mamie Jellett's The Virgin of Erua, and an interesting take, triptych with the Virgin and probably St. Patrick here and Bridget here. And then we look at, and if you want to look at these in detail again afterwards in questions and answers, we can do so. Here's another image from Mamie Jellett's work, The Achill Horses. You can see the wonderful horses here, the power of nature standing up here on a cliff. There's something resembling a prow of a boat embodied into the cliff. And of course, you see the water around it. And it all harkens back, of course, to the Celtic sea god, god of the harvest and god of horses, Monadán Mac Lir, drawing again upon an ancient tradition. And here you see this other piece by Mamie Jellett, Waterfall. It's almost Japanese in its composition, and it is absolutely marvelous. You could look at it for ages. And that, so this is the type of modernist movement in art that Mccreavy had advanced. And it was far better than the sort of twee, leprechaunish and shamrogery stuff that some of the insularists were engaging in at the time. And here then we have the other figure, Jack B. Yates, who was a very close friend of Mccreavy's as well. And Mccreavy said of him, he depicted human dignity in everyday life. And this was the thrust of the modernist movement, to reflect reality and to reflect the nobility of reality, hope for the future, and drawing strength from the past. And here you see Jack B. Yates' Men of Destiny. Marvelous work there, the fishermen on the west coast of Ireland going out into the waves. This was the real heroism of the people. And then you have here Jack B. Yates' Freedom, again, use of the horse like Mamie Jellett as symbolic of the nation, majestic creatures, powerful creatures, noble creatures, and intelligent creatures. And there you see the horse expressing freedom. And then, because we're based in Kerry, I thought I'd put this one up that not many people know about, Jack B. Yates's Tralee. This is certainly a realist, as there you can see a group of women and men there on the Tralee Canal that connects out towards Blennerville and into Tralee Bay. And you can see a few little fishing vessels there to the side. They're all moored up. And you have the grey sky. There's no pale moon shining over Tralee. And it would seem to suggest, I suppose, the reality of the economic war that De Valera had inflicted on the country, and among other things, and the sense of, I suppose, economic stagnation. And that, but there you are. So this again is reflective of reality, but there is still that sense of hope. There's that sense of confidence that comes through, and particularly, I suppose, looking there at the women walking there past the man who's staring into the water. And this is the book Jack B. Yates, The Appreciation by Thomas Mccreavy. Now, I'm going to read for you here a very interesting observation made by Samuel Beckett in his review of this work in the Irish Times, Saturday, the 4th of August, 1945. And Beckett writes, and here this gives you the insight to what I'm saying earlier about Mccreavy and modernism. Mr. Mccreavy sees in Mr. Yates the first great painter, the first great Irish painter that Ireland has produced, or indeed could have produced, the first to fix plastically with completeness and for his time finality, which is peculiar to the Irish scene and to the Irish people. This is the essence of his interpretation, and it permeates the essay in all its parts. The position is made clear at the outset. And here Beckett quotes Mccreavy's text. Mccreavy says, "What was unique in Ireland was that the life of the people considered itself and was, in fact, spiritually and culturally, as well as politically, the whole life of the nation. Those who acted for the nation officially were outside the nation. They had a stronger sense of identity with the English governing class than with the people of Ireland, and their art was no more than a province of English art. The first genuine artist, therefore, who so identified himself with the people of Ireland as to be able to give true and good and beautiful artistic expression to the life they lived, and to that sense of themselves as the Irish nation, inevitably became not merely a genre painter like the painters of the petit peuple or the little people in other countries, and not merely a national painter in the sense that Paul de Limbourg or Louis Le Nain or Bazzano or Slade or Jan Steen were national painters, but the national painter in the sense that Rembrandt and Velázquez and Watteau were national painters, the painter who in his work was the consummate expression of the spirit of his own nation at one of the supreme points in its evolution." And then Beckett continues, "This, the Constable and Watteau analogies, the statement of the political backgrounds to the first until now about 1923, and the second periods, the elucidations of Helen and the blood of Abel, seem to me art criticism of a high order indeed. They constitute an affirmation of capital importance, not only for those who feel in this way about Mr. Yates, or for those who as yet feel or nothing about Mr. Yates, but also for those such as myself who feel in quite a different way about Mr. Yates." So Mccreavy and his exercise of influence for the benefit of the nation can be seen here in these publications of his works. Right back to the 1920s, he is promoting the literature and the artistry of Ireland, interpreting it for an international audience using the contemporary genre of modernism and explaining it to them. He is a cultural ambassador for Ireland in this regard. And in 1950, Mccreavy was appointed director of the National Gallery of Ireland, and he was instrumental in expanding its collections of Spanish, Italian, Dutch, and French masters. Also in that year, Mccreavy and fellow Kerryman, the internationally acclaimed scriptural authority, Monsignor Edward Kissan of Ballydonoghue-Lizelton, they both knew each other through the Coulihan family of Tarbert. Mccreavy was a friend of theirs and Kissan was a cousin. And they were both good friends of the millionaire art collector and philanthropist Sir Alfred Chester Beatty. And this helped to persuade Beatty to move to Ireland. And some years later, under Mccreavy's influence, Beatty bequeathed the priceless collections to the Irish nation. Also during this period, Mccreavy receives international recognition and high state honours. 1948, he was honoured by France, being made a Chevalier de Légion d'honneur for his services to the arts. In 1962, he was promoted to the higher grade of officier. Later, he was honoured by Italy with the Medal of Merit in 1955, and in 1963, he received the Silver Cultural Medal from the Italian Foreign Ministry. And in 1957, he was awarded an honorary Doctorate of Letters, the Dilit Honoris Causa, by the National University of Ireland. So what were the roots and early formative influences of Mccreavy's cosmopolitanism? What enabled this boy from Tarbert in North Kerry to engage at the highest levels in Spain, in France, in London? And it all comes down to the education in his formative years in Tarbert. And not just only the education, but the people that he knew outside of school as well as within. And in his own memoirs, there you see Mccreavy's house. There's an old photograph of it there and the plaque on the wall commemorating him there. That's a more modern photograph of the house. So in his own memoirs and his own diaries and notes, biographical notes, he mentions the house overflowing with books in practically every room. Byron, Scott, Burns, Shakespeare, Tennyson, Longfellow, Thomas Moore, the Irish poet, Goethe, Schiller, Cervantes, Lope de Vega, Maupassant, Baudelaire. As you can see, ladies and gentlemen, these are just some of the range of authors that he was familiar with from reading as a child. It's the age before the television, and it is an age where people read, and there was considerable reading done. And as you can see, his parents were also a major influence on him, particularly Thomas Mccreavy, his father, and his mother, Margaret née Enright. Now, Margaret was a school teacher at the National School in Tarmans, a townland south of the village of Tarbert. And Margaret Enright's family had very deep roots in North Kerry. The Enrights, or Moch Enrochtig, as they're called in Irish, were the hereditary family of Brehon lawyers to the Earls of Desmond. And this was something that Mccreavy was aware of, as his mother and his grandmother, whom he used to spend many ages on her farm outside Tarbert, was well aware of. And they were also the family of the martyr Daniel O'Hanrahan of Lislochton, one of the Franciscan friars murdered in Lislochton by the English in 1580, when the place was sacked. So Mccreavy was very conscious of this growing up, as indeed it was a tradition very strong in the family. And his mother being a teacher, naturally knowledge was a high premium placed on it. And again, like so many families where resources may have been scarce, the emphasis was on education, getting scholarships, and advancing. And Mccreavy is certainly an example of that, as indeed there are many others right across Kerry and Limerick and elsewhere who did the same. Then Mccreavy mentions his teachers, Master Hines and the young Master Lavery. And again, some of you will remember the late Jacko Lavery in Tarbert. And he was a long-standing teacher in Tarbert, headmaster of the school, and a great figure, great character. And I understand that he and Mccreavy had a particularly strong and close friendship. And Jacko's granddaughter, Mary Lavery Carrig, has spoken about this before, and has the letters and correspondences between them. And it's a very special link there. And then Mccreavy mentioned how in that curriculum in primary school, they had a range of subjects, much broader range of subjects than they have now. And they got a very thorough grounding in grammar, in numeracy. And these were the essential tools that enabled young people like Mccreavy to expand their minds and to broaden their horizons, because they had a firm foundation. This is what enabled Mccreavy to learn other languages. And in the primary school curriculum in Tarbert at that time, as in other places around Ireland, pre-independence Ireland, they had, apart from English, if they wished to learn Irish, there was an Irish teacher brought into the school from the Common Gaelic. And Mccreavy's mother was involved with that, and with the Irish language movement. Also, they had Latin. And Latin is what provided Mccreavy, as he said himself, with his great foundation for learning French and Spanish. And in that regard, Mccreavy also benefited greatly from tutelage of Father Daniel Foley, who was a parish priest of Tarbert between 1859 and 1906. And therefore, the young boy, Mccreavy, had served as his altar boy, had gone with him on the station masses to the farmers' houses around the parish, etc. Mccreavy recounts these things in his memoirs as well. But also the fact that Foley was a graduate of La Sorbonne, the great university of Paris. In those days, priests were highly educated, and he was ordained in the Irish College in Paris. So he had a French library, and he lent books to Mccreavy, great French authors, for instance, taught Mccreavy rudiments of French as well, gave him his foundation, and Latin. And it was through Foley that Mccreavy came to appreciate his first appreciation of the visual arts, because it was Father Foley who edified and beautified the Roman Catholic Church in Tarbert and brought magnificent paintings over from Paris, as well as statues. And fortunately, we were able to rescue and revive and repaint the statue of the Sacred Heart that Foley had brought to Tarbert in 1871. That's in the parish church itself. And then the other great statue was of Our Lady, the Immaculate Heart, which is in the square in Tarbert, enshrined there. And these were from the Parisian workshops. And this is the sort of thing that had a huge impact on Mccreavy's mind. And also, Mccreavy had a very close connection with his friendly bookseller, Dan Flavin of Listowel, Flavin's bookshop there. And Mccreavy, gives us marvelous insights into the marvelous range of books, not just only of Irish interest or English interest, but international interest. and he stocked many of the great authors from the French and the German and the Spanish traditions in the original languages, but also in translation. But the fact that they were available in translation enabled young people from the area to open and expand their minds. And Mccreavy certainly did that. So much so that at the age of 14, he passed with flying colors through the state civil service examinations and went on to a stellar career, ending up in the intelligence division of the Admiralty before going into service, active service on the battlefield in World War I. So in this regard, we come now to that reflection of Mccreavy's cosmopolitanism in poetry that focus on aspects of the locality. And I'm going to draw you in now here to perhaps one of the loveliest of poems that he has written, and that is the Homage to Marcel Proust, probably written after the death of Mccreavy's father in April 1930. His mother died in 1936. And we'll start with this poem. The sea gleamed deep blue in the sunlight, through the different greens of the trees, and the talk was of singing. My mother, dressed in black, recalled a bright image from a song, those endearing young charms. Thomas Moore. Miss Holly, wearing heliotrope, had a sad line. The waves are still singing to the shore. Then as we came out from the edge of the wood, the island lay dreaming in the sun across the bridge. Even the white Coast Guard station had gone quietly to sleep. It was Sunday. And a chain on a ship at the pier rattled to silence. Cries of children playing sounded faintly, and musically somewhere a young sailor of the island. He was tall and slim and curled to the moustaches, and he wore earrings, but often he was too ill to be at sea. Was singing, Maid of Athens, ere we part. Looking suddenly like a goddess, Miss Holly said, half smiling, listen. And we stopped in the sunlight, listening. The young sailor is dead now. Miss Holly also is dead. And Byron. Home they've gone, and the waves are still singing. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that very poem tells you everything. His mother recalls a song, the words, Those Endearing Young Charms by Thomas Moore. And Miss Holly recalls the line, the waves are still singing to the shore. And that gives you a sense of that culture of a world where people recited. They had their songs, they had their poems, their party pieces, the parlor evenings. Remember, pride and pianos, whatever about the poverty. They certainly had their pride, their pianos, and their parlor games and parlor singing, etc. But that gives you that sense of the culture in which Mccreavy grew up in. The sailor of the island that he talks about has been identified to me as a Thomas Histon. The Histons were an old family in Tarbert Island who had many members serving in merchant navies around the world, etc., great seafaring family. And their descendants are still in Tarbert to this day. And here you have on your screen, looking suddenly like a goddess, Miss Holly. And I should like to acknowledge here Mr. Michael Holly of the Square Tarbert and Manhattan and Palm Beach and the Hamptons for sending me this wonderful photograph of her. And just looking down here, there you see the full photograph of Miss Delia Holly and Mr. David Meskel on their wedding day. Now, Miss Holly was herself also a teacher, like Mccreavy's mother. They were very good friends. And Miss Holly was one of those people who, at the last moment, decided not to go on that ill-fated boating expedition across to Kilrush, the famous Tarbert tragedy of 1898. And later she married Mr. David Meskel, and this is a photograph of their wedding day. So thank you, Michael, if you're listening. Much appreciated getting that photograph from you. And there you see another view onto the island. I'm trying to avoid the awful wreck called the power station. But this is a view from the Woodland Walk as it comes to its end at Gorgon Point, which is the last bend on the island road before crossing the causeway to the island. Why is it called Gorgon Point? Because the ship HMS Gorgon was a floating artillery that was anchored off that point to protect the Shannon from French attack or potential French attack while the gun battery was being built on the island and the other one across at County Clare in Kilkerran Point. And there is the view of the old pier and the new pier at Tarbert. And it would have been about here that you have Gorgon Point, and that's where Miss Holly and Mrs. Mccreavy and the young Thomas Mccreavy and others would have come out from under the canopy of the trees to view the island bathed in sunlight. So there you have. And there is Joseph Charles Barrow's illustration of Tarbert Island about 1795. There's Tarbert House there, the woodland coming down to the Coast Guard station. And here are the fortifications on the island itself. And the gun battery was later built up there above that tree line. And that just gives you a sense there. And there's the Gorgon anchored off Gorgon Point. So that gives you a sense of the world that he grew up in. And here is Lislochton itself and the Mccreavy family grave here in the cemetery beside Lislochton Friary. So his parents, Thomas and Margaret Mccreavy, and their daughters, Margaret, Winifred, and Delia, are all buried here. May they rest in peace. So the other poem that shows Mccreavy's engagement of modernism and cosmopolitanism with the local is St. Sennan's Well, published in the Dial in 1928. And the reason I have this in here is because Thomas Mccreavy's niece, the late Margaret Farrington, who only died there last year, she told me that he wrote this shortly after her sister Elizabeth had made a miraculous recovery. And the reason she told me this is because my own great-grandfather, old Jack Downey, was involved in that. Elizabeth was only an infant and had developed a very serious illness and meningitis, and it didn't seem as if she was going to survive. And the local GP, Dr. Roger Barrett, tried to do his best for her and said, look, I think at this stage it's a matter of praying. And her mother asked my grandfather if he would bring them in his horse and trap up to St. Sennan's Well in Tarmans. So he did. And she brought her little girl up to the Holy Well in Tarmans. It's a townland south of Tarbert. There's a well there dedicated to Saint Senan. Saint Senan is the local patron saint of this region of North Kerry, from Askeaton in West Limerick all the way down the Shannon estuary to Ballybunion and over to Lixnaw. And there are a number of places associated with him there. And Mccreavy wrote this poem, having been told that his niece had survived. Saint Senan's Well. I make a response to lips I would kiss once, and wonder where tangents finish. The sunlit discs are small, the end of a tangent is very far away. I began my rounds with the sorrowful mysteries instead of the joyful, ready therefore, already for the without of glory. Then another poem, Erua O'Donnell. And this one, along with Nocturne of the Self-Evident Presence, were published under Mccreavy's pseudonym or nom de plume, which he used in his earlier years of writing, L. Saint Senan. Again, you see that connection with Senan, what I was saying about the deep roots of his mother's family in the region. His father was a retired RIC officer who had originally come from the area of North Mayo, South Donegal, and had connections there. So Erua O'Donnell is a marvelous poem, and this was written up following his visit to Spain in 1924. He had gone from Madrid up to Valladolid, the ancient capital of Castilla-Leon, where Red Hugh O'Donnell died tragically in 1600. And Erua had gone to Spain, as you know, to seek more assistance from the king, and died in suspicious circumstances. And Mccreavy, I know a lot of you might be familiar with all this excitement in the media about finding Red Hugh's bones in an archaeological dig in Valladolid. Well, I have it on excellent authority from a member of Red Hugh's family in Spain that those bones were actually exhumed in 1836 and were reburied in the municipal cemetery with all the other bones that were taken out from that old friary before it was, after it was secularized by the state and closed down and later demolished. So, Erua O'Donnell. And here you have, again, an expression of Mccreavy's modernism and his quest to express Ireland's place in Europe. Juan de Juni, the priest, said, each J becoming H. Berejuete, he said, and the G was aspirate. Jimenez, he said then, and aspirated first and last. But he never said, and it seemed odd, he never had heard the aspirated name of the centuries dead, bright-haired young man whose grave I sought. All day I passed in greatly built gloom, from dusty gilt tomb, marvelously wrought, to tomb, rubbing at mouldy inscriptions with fingers wetted with spit and asking where I might find it and failing. Yet when, unhurried, not as at home where heroes hanged are buried, with non-commissioned officers' bored maledictions quickly in the jail yard, they brought his blackening body here to rest, Princes came walking behind it, and all Valladolid knew, and out to Simancas all knew where they buried Red Hugh. There you have Mccreavy's use of our history of engagement with Spain, with Europe, seeking to free ourselves from English domination. And this is the motif that is often used by the modernist movement, using history, not as some form of isolationist retreat, but to show our connections with the wider world. And also, even that use of the aspiration of names in Spanish and in Gaelic, showing the common Latin roots of the grammar and the pronunciation spelling. And indeed, going back further in history to the ancient Milesian origin stories of the early Irish settlers originally coming from Spain, the sons of Milesius, Erua O'Donnell, the great O'Neill being among them. So that is where you see Mccreavy bringing his historical knowledge. He did graduate in history, and using that with his poetic license to produce this wonderful, evocative poem. Mccreavy had been looking for Red Hugh's tomb in the actual cathedral itself in Valladolid, and but he didn't know that actually Red Hugh had been buried in the old Franciscan friary, which by then had been demolished. But Red Hugh's body had actually been buried with the other bodies that were exhumed in the municipal cemetery in Valladolid. So there is the great man himself. And I hope that in the course of the last hour and 10 minutes that I have given you a sense of his significance on the international scene and the interplay of those influences from Madrid and Dublin, London and Paris in his formation in the milieu, the people, the companies, the circles he moved in, and also bringing that back to his native North Kerry, to Tarbert particularly, and the formative influences there that provided him with the foundation for his amazingly stellar career. So, ladies and gentlemen, on that note, thank you very much. And I should just like to say that I like to dedicate this evening's lecture to Mccreavy's niece, the late Margaret Farrington, depicted there with her daughter Raeltine and son-in-law, Mr. Paul Jennings. So thank you very, very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Declan. Very insightful.
Sean O'Brien, that was